David himself calls him Lord, so how is he his son? And the great throng heard him gladly. Now, in some discussions of this text from the Gospel of Mark, people say, well, maybe Jesus is saying that the Messiah is not really a son of David. Although he himself is the Messiah, he is not necessarily a Davidite. I don't think that's the point. I think what Jesus is saying is that the Messiah is a son of David, but more than a son of David. Thus, he's opening the possibility that this coming Davidic king has a very close relationship with Israel's God. And in the context of Psalm 110, you get the idea of sharing the throne and the reign of Yahweh himself. The other thing to remember is where does Jesus engage in this discussion? Where is he? He was in the temple, wasn't he? And who works in the temple? The priests. Now, if you go down in Psalm 110, you get to verse 4, it talks about the coming Davidic king also being in the order of Melchizedek. So here you have Jesus discussing the nature of the Messiah, and he is, implicitly a messianic claimant, perhaps claiming to be, a priest in the order of Melchizedek on the very home turf of the priests. Somewhat provocative action. You can see why later on the priests and the Pharisees and the Herodians later go out and plot against him. But let me give you another example. Go to Mark chapter 14, verses 61 and 62. This is Jesus before the high priest Caiaphas. And Caiaphas asks him in verse 61, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Now, ordinarily, Jesus' response is regarded as a prediction of his second coming. Now, I'm going to very provocatively suggest to you, I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about. Jesus gives a positive answer. Yes, he is the Messiah. But he draws on two texts. Jesus' response is a conflation of two texts. Daniel 7:13 and Psalm 110. What these two texts have in common is the theme of enthronement. And that is a figure other than God being enthroned with the heavenly Lord. In the case of Daniel 7, it's one like a son of man who receives power from the Ancient of Days. And in the case of Psalm 110, it's the Davidic king. Then Jesus is saying to Caiaphas, despite all your designs against me, I am going to be enthroned with Yahweh, the Lord of Israel, of heaven and earth. Now you know why Caiaphas tears his robes and claims blasphemy has been uttered. The only other place, the best other place to see the exposition of Psalm 110 is in Hebrews 7, where the author there presents a very lengthy, if you like, exposition of this psalm to show that Jesus is better than the other priests. As in, his priesthood is better than that of Levi. I mean, the other priests, they died, but this priest lives forever, so his priesthood is eternal. It continues on. And his priesthood was also made with an oath. You can't say that of the Levitical priests, can you? So that's what's going on there. Finally, let's have a few thoughts about what this means for us. How are the royal psalms going to affect the way you eat your porridge tomorrow morning? What does this mean to us in our daily lives? Well, I think it means several things. If Jesus Christ is the ideal king of the world and of Israel, he's the Lord of the church, then it means we need to offer him the ideal form of service, love, and submission. If he is the exemplary king, then he requires exemplary service from his subjects. Nothing less than that is worthy of him. Secondly, Christian discipleship is not a matter of biding time until we make the heavenly journey, but it consists of us establishing cells of believers loyal to the King in waiting, the true and rightful King of heaven and earth, who one day will be by might what he is by right, Lord of all. It means warning people of the judgment to come at the Lord's return and declaring to the instruments of evil in this world that their time is short. Thirdly, Christians live as subjects of this king, and they experience the world raging against them because the world continually rages against God's king. And you find that in Psalm 2. The nations, rage and plot in vain against God's anointed king. Listen to what John Calvin wrote about Psalm 2. I find this fascinating. The consolation which follows is that when the ungodly have mustered their forces, and when, depending on their vast numbers, their riches, and their means of defence, they not only pour forth their proud blasphemies, but furiously assault heaven itself, we may safely laugh them to scorn, relying on this one consideration, that he whom they are assailing is the God who is in heaven. When we see Christ well nigh overwhelmed with the number and strength of his enemies, let us remember that they are making war against God, over whom they shall not prevail. And therefore, their attempts, what they may be, and however increasing, will come to naught and be utterly ineffectual. Let us learn further that this doctrine runs through the whole gospel. For the prayer of the apostles, which I have just quoted, manifestly testifies to it that it ought not be restricted to the person of Christ. In other words, the nations rage against Christ. They also rage against us, but ultimately their defeat is assured because God's kingdom, God's Son, triumphs in the end. Fourthly, another thing to take away is this. The royal psalms also urge us to celebrate, and I mean that in a very real sense, the majestic reign of God in his Son. Those who are lost in the mire of sin, those who are rebelling against God, are not interested in celebrating the reign of Jesus Christ. In fact, those people would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. But we submit to Jesus' kingship, not belligerently, but joyfully. That is because we serve, we honour, and we worship a holy and loving monarch who is Lord of all and Lord for all. Jesus Christ is not Lord for the benefit of his own self-aggrandizement, like certain politicians and dictators we can think of. But he is Lord for the purpose of displaying his glory in us, who are the recipients of his mercy and his grace. Jesus reigns so that he can execute the Father's plan of salvation. I mean, cast your minds on that wonderful throne scene in Revelation 5, where the question is put, who can approach the throne of God? Who can take the scroll and break the seals? And it's a challenge. No one in heaven or on earth or under the earth is able to do it. But there is one who can. One who stands between the 24 elders and the throne. And who is it? The Lion of the tribe of Judah. And when you look at the Lion, what do you see? The Lamb. A Lamb who was slain. That is the King we worship. Not a monarch interested in his own good, his own wealth, his own power, but the self-giving and loving Lamb of God. Finally, from a liturgical or lectionary point of view, I think Easter Sunday, Ascension Day, Christ the King Day, all lend themselves to the teaching and preaching of the Psalms. Okay, let me pause there. Does anyone have any final questions they want to bring up at this point? No? Good. Well, this is great stuff. Why don't we finish then singing one of these royal psalms? Why don't we finish singing a couple of verses from Psalm 2 according to the Sing Psalms? And if I can invite Martin, would you like to lead us in the Sing Psalms?